My name is Evelyn Reed, and for what feels like a lifetime, the person I see in the mirror has been a stranger, a carefully constructed fiction. The real me, the one who knows things, was supposed to have died a long, long time ago, buried under a mountain of classified documents and a headstone with the wrong name on it. They don't know I'm making this tape. If they did, well, the men who built my new life are very, very good at cleaning up loose ends. I'm in a small, anonymous motel room 1,000 miles from anywhere I've ever called home. The air smells of stale cigarette smoke and bleach, and through the thin curtains, the neon vacancy sign blinks a rhythmic, sickly red, casting pulsing shadows across the cheap particle board desk where this old cassette recorder is whirring. The sound is a comfort, a mechanical heartbeat in the oppressive quiet. I bought it at a pawn shop this morning, paid in cash, just like I paid for the room and the bus ticket to get here. I have to do this. I have to, because I saw a report last night on a 24-hour news channel I was watching just to pass the time. It was a small segment, filler about a new deep space probe being launched, something about mapping dark matter. They mentioned it had picked up a strange, persistent signal, a background resonance they couldn't explain. The lead scientist, a young, optimistic man who couldn't have been born when it all started, he just smiled and called it interesting background noise. But I know that noise. I know its texture. I heard it for the first time in my dreams, and then I heard it in the waking world, coming from the mind of a man who was no longer there. I have to tell someone what really happened. Someone else needs to know the truth before it's all buried for good, before the pattern starts all over again with that new probe, before they open that door again. You have to understand, it was never supposed to be like this. It all started in the summer of 1969, a season of impossible optimism. We had put a man on the moon. We felt, as a nation, that there was no frontier we couldn't conquer, no secret the universe could keep from us. I was a nurse then, a young one, just 26 years old, assigned to the medical wing at Edwards Air Force Base. It was the place where gods were made, where brave men with the right stuff strapped themselves to rockets and punched holes in the sky. He was one of them, Captain John Harding. Everyone just called him Jack. To look at him was to look at the living embodiment of an American hero. He was 32 years old, with a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite, eyes the color of the desert sky, and a slow, easy smile that could disarm generals and make nurses blush. He walked with a kind of coiled energy, a quiet confidence that wasn't arrogance. It was the earned assurance of a man who had flown faster and higher than almost any other human being on the planet. He was the prime pilot for the X-15 program, that beautiful, terrifying black dart of an aircraft that was less a plane and more a manned missile. They were pushing the envelope, they always said, flying at the very edge of space, a place they called the Kármán line, where the blue of the atmosphere bled into the infinite star-dusted black. I remember the morning of the flight vividly. The air in the Mojave Desert has a special quality at dawn, clean and sharp and filled with the scent of creosote and cold sand. There was a buzz around the base, a palpable tension that always preceded a major test flight. I was in the mess hall, getting a cup of what passed for coffee, and Jack was there with his 2-man ground crew going over a final checklist. He wasn't eating. He never did before a flight. He just nursed a cup of black coffee, his gaze distant. I remember he caught my eye and gave me that slow smile. "Morning, Nurse Reed," he said, his voice a low baritone. "Keeping the coffee hot for when I get back?" I smiled back, my professional demeanor a thin shield against the sheer charisma of the man. "We'll have a fresh pot on, Captain. You just make sure you come back for it." He just nodded, his eyes already somewhere else, somewhere up there. "That's the plan," he said. And then he and his team were gone, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall. The mission was designated Flight 192-7. The goal was to test a new ablative material on the leading edge of the wings at extreme altitude and re-entry temperatures. A routine mission, if you could call anything involving being dropped from the wing of a B-52 at 45,000 feet and lighting a rocket engine routine. I wasn't in the main control room, of course. I was on standby at the primary medical station, a small, sterile building not far from the main runway. We could hear the comms chatter piped in over a speaker on the wall. The voice of the mission controller, a man named Gene, was a steady, calming drone, a litany of numbers and technical jargon. X-ray 15, you are go for launch. Jack's voice came back, impossibly calm, laced with just a faint crackle of static. Roger. Control. It's a beautiful day up here. Then came the countdown, the release, and the guttural, earth-shaking roar of the XLR-99 engine igniting. Even from inside our concrete building, you could feel it, a vibration that went right through the soles of your shoes and into your bones. We followed his ascent on a tracking monitor, a tiny green blip climbing an impossibly steep arc, passing 100,000 feet. Mach 3. 200,000 feet. The numbers just kept climbing. He was a human bullet, screaming towards the heavens. Then, at the absolute apex of his flight, somewhere around 350,000 feet, well into what was considered space, something happened. First, the telemetry feed from his biomonitors went haywire. The clean, rhythmic lines of his heart rate and respiration turned into a chaotic scribble, a burst of pure static. "Jack, we've got some interference on your biofeed," Gene's voice said, still calm but with a new edge. "Can you confirm your status?" There was a pause, a few seconds of empty air that felt like an eternity. Then Jack's voice came back, but it was different. It wasn't pained or scared. It was confused. "Control, wow. Seeing lights up here. Not stars. It's like a curtain of light." Before Gene could respond, there was a single, sharp crackle over the comms, a sound like a bullwhip snapping right next to the microphone, and then silence. His biofeed flatlined, not in the way of death, but in the way of a disconnected wire. The channel was just dead air. The control room erupted into a controlled panic. "X-ray 15, do you copy? Captain Harding, respond." Nothing. Just the faint, empty hiss of deep space. For 7 minutes, the world held its breath. His plane, now a glider, was following its ballistic arc back towards the atmosphere. A silent, unguided projectile. Everyone assumed the worst. A catastrophic electrical failure, a life support malfunction, or worse. We were all preparing for a recovery mission, not a rescue. But then, something impossible happened. The X-15's automated systems, the primitive autopilot designed only for basic stabilization, kicked in. The plane oriented itself perfectly for re-entry, its landing gear deployed. It glided down towards the Rogers dry lake bed, its trajectory as clean and perfect as any landing jack had ever made himself. It touched down with a gentle puff of dust and skidded to a graceful stop, sitting pristine and silent on the vast, cracked earth under the blazing California sun. The relief was immense, a tidal wave of it, but it was short-lived. The rescue teams swarmed the aircraft, and when they cracked the canopy, the real mystery began. Captain John Harding was sitting in his pilot's seat, his hands resting lightly on the controls. His eyes were closed. He looked peaceful, serene, as if he were simply asleep. But he wouldn't wake up. They couldn't rouse him. He was breathing steadily. His heart was beating. He was, by every medical definition, alive. But he was gone. He had landed the plane safely, but the pilot never came home. He was in a deep, unresponsive coma. And that night, in my small, quiet room in the nurses' barracks, I had the first dream. It wasn't like any dream I'd ever had before. There was no story, no narrative. It was just a place. I was floating, weightless, over a vast, sprawling city. But the city was all wrong. The buildings were made of a substance that seemed to drink the light, a material that was both black and iridescent, like an oil slick on obsidian. The architecture was a nightmare of impossible geometry. Towers twisted at angles that should have made them collapse, spiraling into a sky that was not black with night, but a deeper, more profound blackness, the color of a void. And hanging in that void, where a sun or moon should have been, was a disk of perfect, absolute black, a black sun. It gave off no light, only a palpable sense of ancient cold. I felt no fear, not at first, just a profound sense of awe and a deep, unsettling feeling of utter alienness. The silence was the most terrifying part. It was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered all thought. There were no people, no movement, just the silent, dead geometry of that impossible place. I drifted over streets that curved back on themselves, past archways that led into nothingness, and I felt, with a certainty that chilled me to my soul, that I was being watched, not by a person, but by the city itself. The entire metropolis was a single, conscious entity, and I was a microbe under its vast, unblinking gaze. I woke up with a gasp, my heart hammering against my ribs, the sheets soaked with a cold sweat. The image of the black sun was burned into the back of my eyelids. I sat there, shaking in the pre-dawn gloom, and I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't a nightmare. It was a destination. The next morning, I stumbled into the ward's break room, my mind still foggy with the residue of the dream. Sarah, another nurse who had been on shift, was there, staring into her coffee cup as if it held the secrets of the universe. She looked pale, her eyes wide and haunted. "Rough night?" I asked, trying for a normal tone. She looked up at me, and a flicker of something, of recognition, passed through her eyes. "I had the most god-awful dream," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I was flying over this city." My blood ran cold. I felt the fine hairs on my arms stand up. I didn't say anything. I just stared at her. "The buildings," she continued, her voice barely audible. "They were wrong, all twisted. And the sun, it was black." I dropped my coffee cup. It shattered on the linoleum floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden ringing silence of the room. We just stared at each other, the shared, impossible knowledge passing between us. We had been to the same place, and we both knew, without having to say it, where it came from. It came from the man lying silent in room 3, the pilot who had gone to the edge of space and brought something back with him, not in his ship, but in his head. Within 24 hours, it wasn't just Sarah and me. It was a contagion of the mind. A young orderly, a kid named Peterson, was found weeping uncontrollably in a supply closet, babbling about a dead city in the sky. Dr. Morrison, a seasoned physician who had seen everything from catastrophic crash injuries to combat fatigue, walked off the ward in the middle of his shift, his face a mask of gray terror. He simply got in his car and drove away, and no one ever saw him at the base again. The official story was a family emergency. We knew better. He'd had the dream. The ward, once a place of quiet, efficient healing, became a place of whispers and sidelong glances. The air grew thick with a creeping psychological dread. People started calling in sick. Nurses would invent any excuse to avoid being assigned to Captain Harding's room. We'd draw lots, and the loser would go in, their face pale, to check his vitals, change his IV drip, and get out as fast as they possibly could. The room itself began to feel wrong. The clinical sterility was gone, replaced by a strange, palpable coldness that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was a deep, psychic chill that seemed to emanate from the still figure in the bed. This couldn't be kept quiet for long. The Air Force is a closed system, but it runs on people, and people talk. The news of the spooked ward, as it was being called, made its way up the chain of command with alarming speed. 2 days after my shared nightmare with Sarah, they arrived. They didn't come in a flurry of sirens and official cars. They just appeared. 2 men. The first was Major Harding. No relation to the pilot, a cruel irony we all noted. A man who seemed to be made entirely of sharp angles and polished surfaces. His uniform was so crisply starched it looked like it could cut you. His shoes gleamed like black mirrors, and his eyes were small, cold, and missed nothing. He was the quintessential military bureaucrat, a man who saw problems not in terms of human suffering, but as logistical snags that needed to be ironed out, flattened, and filed away. The second man was his opposite in every way. He was a civilian, a man named Dr. Eris Thorne. He was introduced as a consultant from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA. He was tall and stooped, with a tweed jacket that was rumpled and stained with what looked like coffee and ink. His hair was a chaotic black mop, and he wore thick-rimmed glasses that magnified his eyes, which were constantly moving, taking in every detail with a fierce, unnerving intelligence. Where Major Harding exuded authority, Dr. Thorne exuded a predatory curiosity. They set up shop in an empty office down the hall and began a systematic interrogation of the entire medical staff. It wasn't an investigation. It felt like a vivisection of our minds. I was called in on the second day. The room was small, windowless. Major Harding sat behind a metal desk, his hands steepled, his expression unreadable. Dr. Thorne paced back and forth in the small space, a coiled bundle of nervous energy. "Nurse Reed," Major Harding began, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "We are trying to understand the morale problem that has developed on this ward." I remember feeling a surge of anger. "It's not a morale problem, Major. It's something else. People are terrified." Thorne stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes locking onto mine. "Terrified of what, precisely?" he asked, his voice soft, almost conspiratorial. "A dream?" I took a deep breath. "It's not just a dream, Doctor. It's the dream. Everyone is having it. The same one." Thorne pulled up a chair and sat down, leaning forward, his intensity a physical force. "Describe it," he said. "Don't leave anything out. Every detail. The architecture, the light, the sun." And so I told him. I described the oily, light-devouring material of the buildings, the impossible, painful angles of the structures, the oppressive, absolute silence. And I told him about the black sun, the feeling of being observed by the city itself. Harding listened with a look of thinly veiled impatience, as if this was all a waste of his valuable time. But Thorne listened with a hungry, focused stillness. He didn't take notes. He just watched my face, his own expression a mixture of fascination and something else. Something that looked disturbingly like recognition. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Harding cleared his throat. "Mass hysteria," he said, as if pronouncing a final verdict, "brought on by the stress of a high-profile incident. You're all influencing each other." But Thorne shook his head slowly, never taking his eyes off me. "No," he said, his voice quiet. "This isn't hysteria. Hysteria is chaotic. This is consistent. The geometric descriptions are too specific, too uniform across all accounts. This is a data set." He turned to Harding. "Major, I need full access to the patient. I need to set up my own monitoring equipment, EEG, magnetoencephalography, everything." Harding looked like he was about to object, but Thorne cut him off. "This is no longer a medical situation, Major," he said, a new, harder edge to his voice. "This is a signal intelligence problem. The patient isn't in a coma." He paused, letting the weight of his next words fill the room. "He's broadcasting." That was the moment everything changed. The ward was officially locked down. A perimeter was established. We, the remaining medical staff, were no longer just caregivers. We were part of the experiment. We were the canaries in the coal mine. Thorne and his small team of technicians, flown in overnight from some black budget lab, descended on Captain Harding's room. They filled it with strange, humming machines, consoles covered in dials and glowing screens, and reels of magnetic tape that turned with a soft, whispery hiss. They attached a new, more complex web of sensors to the captain's head, a silver mesh cap that bristled with dozens of electrodes. I was kept on, along with Sarah and a few other nurses who hadn't broken yet. Our job was simple: maintain the pilot's physical health and report any psychological anomalies, in ourselves or the others. We were lab rats, and we knew it. One evening, about a week into Thorne's investigation, I was standing outside the glass door of Harding's room, watching the technicians work. Thorne was inside, staring intently at a large oscilloscope, a device that drew glowing green patterns on a circular screen. The line on the screen was not the familiar jagged wave of a human brain. It was a complex, repeating geometric pattern. It looked like a schematic, a circuit diagram drawn by a madman. It looped and folded in on itself, a visual representation of the impossible city from our dreams. Thorne beckoned me into the room. The air inside was freezing, and the hum of the machines was a constant low thrum. "Look at this, nurse," he said, pointing to the screen. "You see that? That's not a brainwave. The alpha, beta, theta waves, they're still there, underneath, faint, like a ghost. But this is the primary signal. It's piggybacking on his neural pathways. It's overwritten his consciousness." He looked from the screen to the still form of Captain Harding in the bed. His mind, his brain, it's become an antenna. When he was up there, at the edge of space, he wasn't just exposed to cosmic radiation. He was exposed to something else. A signal. A broadcast from somewhere else. And it didn't just pass through him. It imprinted on him. It downloaded itself into the wetware of his brain. I stared at the glowing alien symbol on the screen, my mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what he was saying. "And the dreams?" I whispered. "The city." Thorne finally looked at me, and for the first time, I saw not scientific curiosity in his eyes, but a sliver of genuine, profound fear. "That's the broadcast, Nurse Reed," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We're not just dreaming about it. When we sleep, our minds are vulnerable, suggestible. We're receiving it. He's a psychic transmitter, and anyone who gets too close for too long tunes in." He pointed a trembling finger at the pilot. "He's not Jack Harding anymore. He's just a radio stuck on a single alien station." The dream field, as Dr. Thorne began to call it, wasn't a stable phenomenon. It intensified. It was like a radio signal getting stronger, the volume slowly being turned up day by day. At first, you had to be on the ward for a full shift, 8 hours, to be reasonably certain you'd have the dream. Then it became 6 hours, then 4. The psychological toll was devastating. We were living in a constant state of low-grade terror, fueled by caffeine and a creeping dread of our own beds. Sleep, which should have been a refuge, became the enemy. You'd lie down, exhausted, and fight to stay awake, because you knew what was waiting for you the moment you lost consciousness. You knew you'd be back in that silent, dead city, drifting under the gaze of that black sun. The breakdowns became more frequent and more severe. I remember one of Thorne's own technicians, a young man named Casey, who had seemed so detached and professional. He spent a little too long in the room one afternoon, calibrating a new sensor array. That night he started screaming in the barracks, not just screaming in his sleep, but a full-blown psychotic episode. He was awake, his eyes wide open, but he wasn't seeing the room. He was clawing at his own face, yelling about the sharp angles and the walls that watch. He kept shouting, "It sees me! It sees me!" He had to be sedated and was flown out on a medical transport before dawn. We never heard what happened to him. Major Harding's solution was typically bureaucratic and utterly devoid of empathy. He instituted a new protocol. No single staff member was to have more than 1 hour of cumulative exposure to what he clinically termed the anomaly zone, the space within a 50-foot radius of Captain Harding's room, in any 24-hour period. We began to work in a strange, high-stakes relay race. A nurse would rush in, check the IV, monitor the vitals, make a note on the chart, and rush out, all in a matter of minutes before another nurse would do the same an hour later. We were like swimmers trying to hold our breath, dipping into a toxic environment for a few precious moments before surfacing for air. The ward became a ghost town, punctuated by the brief, frantic scurrying of a nurse or a technician on their timed rotation. But the field was still getting stronger. The 1-hour rule wasn't enough. People who were just walking down the corridor, well outside the supposed 50-foot zone, started reporting fragments of the dream. A fleeting image of a twisted spire. The lingering feeling of cold, silent observation. It was leaking. The psychic pressure was building. I seemed to be more resistant than most. I still had the dream every single night, but I had developed a strange coping mechanism. I had learned to become a passive observer. In the dream city, I forced myself not to think, not to feel. I became a ghost, a disembodied point of view, drifting on the silent currents. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just a phantom signal playing on my sleeping mind. It was a fragile defense, a paper-thin wall of denial. But it was the only thing keeping me sane. Dr. Thorne noticed my resilience. He started seeking me out, not for formal interviews in the sterile office, but for quiet, hushed conversations in the empty hallways. The scientific arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate need to understand. He looked ragged, exhausted. He wasn't sleeping either, I realized. He was too afraid. "It's an active signal, Evelyn," he told me one night, using my first name for the first time. He was leaning against the wall, his face illuminated by the dim red glow of an exit sign. I was wrong to think of it as a simple broadcast like a radio tower. That's a passive analogy. This is active. It probes, it learns. He ran a hand through his already chaotic hair. When it first imprinted on Harding, it was just a raw data dump, the architecture of that place. But now, it's interacting with our minds. It's learning what we are. It's using our own neurochemistry, our memories, our fears, to refine the broadcast. He looked at me, his magnified eyes wide with a terrible revelation. It's not just showing us the city anymore, is it? It's starting to put things in the city. He was right. Over the last few nights, the dream had changed. The city was no longer empty. In the distance, strange, elongated shadows would flicker in my peripheral vision. I would hear a sound that was almost, but not quite, a human whisper, carried on the silent air. And once, just before waking, I had looked down one of the impossible winding streets and seen a figure standing there. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs too long, its form indistinct like a heat haze. But it was turned towards me, and I knew with a certainty that was like a physical blow that it was the architect. It was the thing that had built this place, and it had finally noticed me. The pilot in the bed was no longer just a passive antenna. He had become a gateway. The signal wasn't just a recording of an alien reality. It was a live feed. And something on the other side was becoming aware of its new audience. The realization was so profound, so terrifying, that I had to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing. We weren't just having nightmares about an alien world. We were trespassing, and the owner was starting to get angry. The breaking point came with Sarah, my friend, the first person I had shared this horror with. Her 1-hour rotation was in the middle of the night. She went into the room, calm and professional as always. 5 minutes later, the silent alarm from Harding's biomonitors went off at the nurse's station. Not the pilot's monitors, the ones they had insisted we all wear now. A small clip on our earlobes that tracked our own heart rates. Sarah's had spiked into a dangerous tachycardia. I ran down the hall. I looked through the glass of the door and I saw her. She was standing perfectly still, next to the captain's bed. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at a blank white wall, her eyes wide with a terror so absolute it seemed to have frozen her solid. Her mouth was open in a silent scream. I didn't even think. I punched in the code and burst into the room. The cold was so intense it felt like walking into a meat locker. "Sarah!" I yelled. She didn't move. She just kept staring at the wall. I grabbed her arm. It was rigid, cold to the touch. I followed her gaze, and my own breath hitched in my throat. There was nothing there. It was just a white, painted wall. But in that moment, I could almost feel it. I could feel what she was seeing. A pressure in the air. A sense of immense, ancient intelligence focusing its attention on that spot. I practically dragged her out of the room, her feet shuffling on the floor. As soon as we were out in the hallway, she collapsed, sobbing, a shuddering, broken wreck. She never said what she saw. She didn't have to. She was flown out that morning, her career over, her mind shattered. That was it. The project, in its current form, was over. We had failed. We couldn't contain it. We couldn't even study it without sacrificing the minds of the researchers. That afternoon, Major Harding called a final meeting with Dr. Thorne and me. He looked grim, his face set like concrete. "A decision has been made at the Pentagon level," he said, his voice clipped. "This facility is being decommissioned. Project Sleeper is being terminated." Thorne looked up, his face a mixture of horror and relief. "Terminated? What does that mean? What are you going to do with him?" Major Harding stared at Dr. Thorne, his eyes cold and empty. "Captain Harding's body will be moved to a permanent long-term containment facility. A more suitable one. His existence, as far as the world is concerned, is over. He will be declared dead. A tragic training accident. A fire during a ground test. The story is still being finalized." I felt a wave of nausea. "You're going to bury him alive," I whispered, "and erase him." Harding's gaze shifted to me. It was the first time he had looked at me with anything other than annoyance. Now his eyes held a sliver of something that might have been pity, or perhaps just a warning. "Nurse Reed," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "What has happened here? The things you think you saw, the things you think you know, it never happened. You will be debriefed. You will sign a lifetime non-disclosure agreement. You will be given a new assignment far from here. And you will never, ever speak of this again. Do you understand?" It wasn't a question. It was an order, an erasure. They weren't just burying Captain Harding. They were burying the truth. And they were burying us right along with it. The transfer was scheduled for the following night, under the cover of absolute darkness. A special team was being flown in, men who dealt with sensitive materials. We, the original staff, were to be nowhere near the ward. We were confined to our barracks, under virtual house arrest, waiting for our debriefings and our new, silent lives. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't let them just take him. Take this incredible, terrifying thing and bury it without some kind of record. Some piece of the truth that wasn't filtered through Major Harding's reports or Dr. Thorne's terrified theories. I needed to understand what happened before. Before the flight. Before the coma. Before the city in our heads. I had to know who John Harding was before he became the sleeper. My mind kept going back to the beginning. To the man with the easy smile and the distant eyes. There had to be something. A clue. A sign that had been missed. And then I remembered. During the initial chaotic days after Harding's accident, before the nightmares began and the lockdown was imposed, I had been tasked with gathering his personal effects from his locker in the pilot's ready room. It was standard procedure. A small metal footlocker filled with the mundane remnants of a life, a spare flight suit, a well-worn copy of a novel, a few letters from his family, a small toolkit. I had packed it all into a box, labeled it, and sent it to be stored in the base's records depot, a dusty, climate-controlled warehouse where the paper and metal lives of soldiers were put to rest. But as I lay on my cot that last night staring at the ceiling, a specific memory surfaced. Deep at the bottom of the footlocker, tucked under a folded flag, there had been a small, flat, cardboard box. It contained a single reel of audio tape, a 5-inch reel of 1/4-inch tape. It was labeled in his own handwriting, a single word, pre-flight. It was probably just a standard psychological evaluation, a pre-mission briefing. Mundane, procedural, but in the context of everything that had happened, it felt like the most important object in the world. I had to get it. Getting out of the barracks was surprisingly easy. The guards posted outside were for show, to keep us in, but they were lazy, confident in their authority. I waited until well after 2 in the morning, when the only sounds were the desert wind and the distant hum of the base's generators. I slipped out a back window, my nurse's uniform traded for dark pants and a sweater. I moved through the shadows, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The records depot was on the far side of the base, a hulking, windowless building that always felt cold inside, even in the desert heat. The lock on the side door was a joke. A simple tumbler I managed to pick with a bobby pin from my hair, a skill I'd picked up from a mischievous patient years ago and never thought I'd use. The air inside the warehouse was stale, thick with the smell of old paper and dust. Rows upon rows of gray metal shelves stretched up into the darkness, a library of forgotten lives. A single, bare bulb in the main aisle cast long, distorted shadows. I found the section for personal effects, and after a frantic 10-minute search, I saw it. A simple cardboard box with a stenciled label, Harding J, capped. My hands were trembling as I lifted it down. It was heavier than I remembered. I pried open the lid. There, on top of the folded flight suit, was the small box containing the audio reel. I grabbed it, my fingers closing around the cool, smooth plastic. But my hand brushed against something else in the box, something that shouldn't have been there. It was a logbook, a standard issue, hard-bound journal. Not a flight log, but a personal one. His name was embossed on the cover. I hadn't seen this before. It must have been tucked away, and in my haste, I'd missed it. I opened it. The first dozen pages were filled with his neat, precise handwriting. Notes on flight dynamics, engineering thoughts, personal reflections. Then, the entries stopped. About a third of the way through the book, there was just one last entry, dated 2 days before his final flight. The handwriting was different. It was frantic, scrawled, the pen digging so hard into the paper it had almost torn through. It consisted of just 3 words, circled over and over again. It's in the voice. My blood ran cold. The voice. What voice? The comms chatter? His own voice? I tucked the journal under my arm and took the tape. I couldn't listen to it here. I needed a reel-to-reel player, and the only ones I knew of on the base were in the ward, in Thorne's makeshift lab. I had to go back. Back to the one place on Earth I never wanted to see again. Sneaking into the medical wing was harder. The security was real there. But I was a ghost in my own hospital. I knew the service corridors, the maintenance tunnels. I came up through a floor panel in a janitor's closet just down the hall from Harding's room. The corridor was empty, silent. The only light came from the soft glow of the equipment spilling from the open door of room 3. The special team hadn't arrived yet. I crept to the doorway and peered inside. The room was a spider's web of cables and wires, all converging on the still figure in the bed. The humming of the machines was louder here, a physical vibration in the air. On a rolling metal cart sat Thorne's audio analysis station, which included a professional-grade reel-to-reel deck. It was a top-of-the-line Ampex machine. I slipped into the room. The cold was immediate, shocking. It felt like walking through a curtain of ice. I tried not to look at Captain Harding, but my eyes were drawn to him. He looked exactly the same. Peaceful, serene, a porcelain shell. But I knew what was raging inside that skull. I knew the alien city was being broadcast from behind those placid eyelids. My hands shook so badly I could barely thread the tape onto the machine. I fumbled with the spools, my fingers feeling thick and clumsy. Finally, it was threaded. I found a pair of heavy-duty headphones, the kind that block out all external sound, plugged them into the jack, and slipped them over my ears. The world went silent, muffled. I took a deep, shuddering breath, my finger hovering over the play button. I was about to listen to a ghost. I pressed play. The reels began to turn with a soft, whispery sound. The first sound through the headphones wasn't a human voice. It was static, but it wasn't the empty, random hiss of a blank tape. It was a strange, rhythmic static, a sound with a texture, a pattern. It was the background noise from the comms channel, just before Harding had reported the curtain of light. It was the sound the scientist on the news had called interesting. It was the sound of the void. And then, through the static, a voice spoke. It was the clear, calm, recorded voice of Dr. Thorne. "This is a supplemental recording," he said, his voice tinny and distant. "For the private file. The official report will state that the primary anomaly was a result of the radiation exposure during Flight 192-7, but I know that's not the whole truth." There was a pause, the sound of him shuffling papers. "I've reviewed the pilot's pre-flight psych evals. All of them. There's something in the audio from his final session, the day before the mission. Something the first analyst flagged as inconclusive dream state ideation. They dismissed it, but they shouldn't have." The recording clicked, and suddenly a new voice filled my ears. It was a psychologist, a woman with a gentle professional tone. "Captain Harding," she was saying, "you mentioned you've been having a recurring dream lately. Can you tell me about it?" There was a pause, and then John Harding's voice, the voice of the living man, filled my head. But it was hesitant, confused. "It's not much of a dream, ma'am," he said slowly. "It's just a place. I'm flying. No plane, just me. And I'm over a city. A big one." My own heart seized in my chest. I felt the blood drain from my face. "And what is this city like, Captain?" the psychologist asked. "It's dark," he said. "The buildings are strange. Not right. And the sun, it's black, like a hole in the sky." The psychologist's voice remained calm, but I could hear a new, subtle note of clinical interest. "And how does this place make you feel?" she asked. Jack Harding was silent for a long time. The only sound was the faint hiss of the tape. Then he spoke, his voice a near whisper, filled with a sense of awe and a dread so profound it made my own soul ache. "It feels," he said, "like I'm finally home." I ripped the headphones from my head as if they were on fire, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. The silence of the room rushed back in, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of his words. "It feels like I'm finally home." He had been there before the flight, before the radiation burst, before he ever climbed into the cockpit of the X-15. The city wasn't something that had been forced upon him. It was a place he already knew. The mission to the edge of space hadn't been an infection. It had been a rendezvous. My mind was reeling, trying to process the impossible implication. The entire premise of our investigation, of Dr. Thorne's theories, was wrong. We thought something alien had imprinted itself on him. But the truth was infinitely more terrifying. What if the alien thing wasn't the city? What if the alien thing was John Harding himself, or something inside him, wearing his skin, that had been dreaming of its home for years, patiently waiting for a chance to phone back? I stared at the man in the bed, and for the first time, I didn't see a victim. I saw a vessel, a Trojan horse. Trembling, I forced myself to put the headphones back on. I had to hear the rest of it. I had to know. I fast-forwarded the tape, past more of the psychologist's gentle, clueless probing. She diagnosed it as pre-mission anxiety, a symbolic representation of the unknown. She had no idea. No one could have. Then I found what I was looking for. Dr. Thorne's voice came back on the tape, low and conspiratorial, recorded much later, probably in this very room. "The dream is the key," he whispered, his voice raspy with exhaustion and fear. "The visual data of the city, the non-Euclidean geometry. It's not just a place. It's a language. It's a form of communication so complex it can only be understood by the subconscious mind. It's a psychic key, designed to unlock something in the recipient's DNA, in their very cellular structure." There was the sound of a match striking, then the sharp inhale of a cigarette. "We thought the radiation burst was the catalyst," he continued, his voice tight with a terrible urgency. "We were wrong. The radiation wasn't the cause. It was the carrier. The high-energy cosmic rays that hit his ship, they weren't random. They were a signal, a targeted burst. It was a response, an activation signal. Something in his mind, in his very being, sent out a passive beacon his entire life, a beacon that said, 'I'm here.' And on that flight, when he finally got high enough, far enough away from the Earth's magnetic interference, something answered. It sent the activation key. It unlocked him. The hum of the machines in the room around me seemed to grow louder, more menacing. The cold deepened. I could feel the presence of the sleeper, not just as a source of a broadcast, but as something listening. So what is he now? Thorne's voice on the tape was barely a whisper. He's not a human in a coma. The John Harding we knew, the pilot, the man, he's gone. His consciousness was the lock. The signal was the key. And when you unlock a door, you open it. Something else has come through. His body is just the hardware, running a new alien operating system. The broadcast, the dream, that's the side effect of the new software booting up. It's rewriting his physical form on a quantum level, turning him into a stable gateway, a biological anchor for the other side. I looked at the EEG monitor. The glowing green line was still tracing its impossible alien symbol over and over. It wasn't a schematic. It was a signature. The signature of the new tenant. And the most terrifying part, Thorne concluded, his voice cracking with despair, is that we've been helping it. All our attempts to study him, the sensors, the energy we've pumped into this room, we thought we were observing a phenomenon. But we've been feeding it. We've been stabilizing the connection. We are the architects of our own destruction. The tape ended with a sharp click, followed by the soft, hissing emptiness of a blank reel. I sat there in the humming, freezing room, paralyzed by the weight of the revelation. This wasn't a rescue mission that had failed. It was an invasion that had, in its own horrifying way, succeeded. Captain Harding hadn't been lost. He had been activated. He was the beachhead, and we, the doctors and nurses, were the unwitting collaborators. My eyes fell on the journal I'd brought with me, still clutched in my other hand. I opened it again to the last, frantic entry. It's in the voice. It wasn't about a voice on the comms. It was about the voice in his head. The voice that had been whispering to him his whole life, showing him images of his home. The voice of the thing that was pretending to be him. I started flipping through the earlier pages of the journal, the ones written in his neat, confident hand. I was looking for anything. Another clue. Another hint of the thing hiding behind the man. And I found it. It was a small, innocuous entry, written months before his final flight. It was a reflection on his childhood. Funny thing to remember now, he had written, lying in the grass as a boy, in the fields behind our house in Ohio. I used to stare up at the sky, at the clouds, but I wasn't looking for shapes, like the other kids. I was listening. I could always hear this sound, a kind of hum, deep in my ears, like the whole world was a machine, and I was the only one who could hear it running. The humming, the low-frequency hum that so many of the staff had reported hearing in the ward, the sound that seemed to come from the very rock beneath our feet. It was his sound, the sound of the entity inside him. It had always been there. Suddenly a new sound cut through the room, not from the headphones, but from the real world. It was the sound of a heavy military truck grinding to a halt outside the medical wing. Then another. The cleanup crew had arrived. They were early. Panic seized me. I had to get out. I ripped the tape from the machine, stuffing it and the journal into the deep pockets of my nurse's jacket. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. The glowing green line on the EEG oscilloscope had changed. It was no longer tracing the same, looping geometric symbol. It was now drawing something new, a different pattern. It was more complex, more angular. And as I stared at it, a wave of dizziness and nausea washed over me. The humming in the room intensified, rising in pitch, and a new thought, a thought that was not my own, slid into my mind like a shard of ice. You know? The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The entity, the thing in the bed. It knew I had listened to the tape. It knew I had read the journal. It knew that I knew its secret. I wasn't just an accidental receiver of its broadcast anymore. I was a target. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. And on the bed, for the first time in all the weeks he had been lying there, the placid, serene expression on Captain John Harding's face began to change. The corners of his mouth, almost imperceptibly, began to curl upwards into the faintest, most terrible hint of a smile. I fled. I didn't even think. My body moved on pure, animal instinct. I scrambled out of the room, back down the service corridor, my breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. I didn't stop running until I was back in the supposed safety of my own room in the barracks, the door locked, a chair wedged under the knob. I collapsed onto the cot, my body shaking uncontrollably. The image of that smile was seared into my brain. It wasn't a human smile. It was the smile of a predator that has just cornered its prey. The debriefing was a blur. The next morning, I was taken to Major Harding's office. He and Dr. Thorne were there, but the dynamic had shifted. Thorne was a ghost. a hollowed-out man who just stared at the wall, his face ashen. Harding was in command, his voice cold and precise. He asked me questions, but he wasn't listening to the answers. He was just going through the motions. Did I experience any anomalous phenomena? Yes. Did I have any materials in my possession related to the project? No. A lie. The tape and the journal were a heavy weight in my pocket, a secret I would carry for the rest of my life. He made me sign a stack of documents, each page stamped with threats of treason and imprisonment. I signed without reading. My signature was a jagged, unreadable scroll. I was given a train ticket, a new identity, and a stark warning to forget everything. But you can't forget a thing that won't let you go. The psychological war began that very night, on the train heading east. I was in a small, private sleeper car, the rhythmic click-clack of the wheels a hypnotic mantra. As I drifted into an exhausted, fretful sleep, I found myself not in the cold, silent city, but somewhere else. I was in the small house where I grew up, in Pennsylvania. It was my childhood kitchen, rendered in perfect dreamlike detail. The smell of my mother's baking, the specific pattern of the faded yellow linoleum on the floor, the way the afternoon sun slanted through the window over the sink. And my mother was there, standing at the stove, her back to me. She looked exactly as she had the day she died, years ago, from a sudden, swift illness. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice thick with a dream-logic grief and a desperate hope. She turned, and her face was wrong. Her eyes were empty, hollow sockets, and her mouth was stretched into that same terrible, knowing smile I'd seen on the pilot's face. "You shouldn't have listened, Evie," she said, her voice not my mother's, but a cold, metallic whisper that echoed with the silence of deep space. "It knows you now." I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, the other passengers in the car banging on my door. That was only the beginning. It followed me. It had my scent. It knew my mind, my memories, my deepest fears and regrets. It had taken them from me, I realized, during all those nights I had spent as a passive receiver in its city. It had cataloged me. Now, it was using my own life as a weapon against me. The waking nightmares started a week later, in the new, anonymous apartment the government had set me up in. I'd be washing dishes, and I'd see a face in the reflection of the window. A distorted, elongated face with too many eyes, staring back at me from the darkness. I'd hear whispers in the static of the radio, my own name woven into the hiss. I heard the voice of a patient I had lost early in my career, a young boy whispering, "You could have saved me, Nurse Reed. Why didn't you save me?" I stopped listening to the radio. I covered the windows. I couldn't sleep. I was living on coffee and terror, jumping at every shadow, every creak of the floorboards. The entity, the thing that wore John Harding's face, was no longer content to just broadcast its alien world. It was reaching out, across hundreds of miles, through a psychic connection I couldn't sever, and it was systematically trying to dismantle my sanity. It wanted to break me. It wanted to silence me. The worst attack came about a month after I'd left Edwards. I had managed to get a job at a quiet suburban hospital, trying to piece together a semblance of a normal life. I was working a late shift, walking down a long, empty, brightly lit corridor. It was sterile, clean, safe. And then, at the far end of the hall, a door opened, and a little girl stepped out. She was about 7 years old with blonde pigtails and a bright yellow dress. She was the spitting image of my younger sister who had died in a car accident when we were children. A death I had always, irrationally blamed myself for, because I was supposed to be watching her that day. "Evie?" the little girl called out, her voice a perfect echo of my sister's. "I'm lost. Can you help me?" I froze, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. I knew it wasn't real. I knew it was the entity using my deepest, most painful memory against me. My training, my experience, my rational mind all screamed at me that it was a hallucination, but my heart broke. She looked so small, so scared. I'm not real, I whispered to myself, my hands clenched into fists. It's not real. It's not her. The little girl started to cry, fat, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. You left me, Evie, she sobbed. Why did you leave me? That was it. Something inside me snapped. The carefully constructed walls of my sanity, the fragile defenses I had built, they all came crashing down. I wasn't a nurse anymore. I wasn't an adult. I was a guilt-ridden child seeing the ghost of her sister. I ran towards her, my arms outstretched, a cry of, "I'm sorry!" torn from my throat. I had to hold her, to tell her it wasn't my fault, to make it right. I ran down that hallway, my feet pounding on the linoleum, and just as I reached for her, she vanished. In her place, standing at the end of the hall, was a fire alarm pull station. In my desperate, hallucinating state, I didn't even slow down. I ran straight into the wall, my hand crashing into the fire alarm's lever, yanking it down with all my strength. The world exploded into the deafening, shrieking clang of the alarm bells. Red lights flashed, sprinklers hissed to life, and the hospital corridor dissolved into chaos. I had just triggered a full-scale fire alarm in a hospital, a catastrophic, irreversible mistake. I stood there, soaking wet, shivering, the insane noise of the bells drilling into my skull. And in the cacophony, I could hear it. Underneath the bells, a low, triumphant hum. The hum of the machine. The hum of the thing in the desert. It had won. It had broken me. I saw my supervisor's face, a mask of fury and confusion. I saw the security guards running towards me. I knew my career, my new life. It was all over. And in that moment of absolute soul-crushing despair, as they led me away, I looked back down the empty corridor, and for just a second, I saw him. Not the little girl. Not the metallic-voiced ghost of my mother. I saw the silhouette of a tall, thin man in a flight suit standing in the shimmering water from the sprinklers. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was just watching me, his head tilted with a cold, clinical curiosity. And I knew with a certainty that was more real than the blaring alarms, that this was just the beginning. My life after that incident became a succession of quiet rooms and carefully chosen words. I was diagnosed with a severe nervous breakdown, post-traumatic stress. They were kind, the doctors, in a detached, clinical way. They didn't know that the trauma I was suffering from was ongoing, that the monster that haunted me wasn't in my past, but was a live feed, piped directly into my head from a concrete bunker in the Nevada desert. I was institutionalized for a time. Not a prison, but a comfortable, quiet place in the countryside where people went to mend their broken minds. For me, it was a different kind of containment. The drugs they gave me helped. They didn't stop the dreams, but they blunted them. They wrapped my consciousness in a thick, cottony fog, so that when I found myself floating over the black sun city, it felt distant, unreal, like watching a movie through a dirty window. The entity's direct attacks on my waking mind lessened. It was as if, having broken me, it had lost interest. Or perhaps the drugs interfered with the signal. Either way, I was left in a state of profound and terrible silence. The whispers faded. The apparitions ceased. I was alone with the echo of what had happened, and in some ways, that was worse. The silence was a new kind of dread. It was the silence of a predator that has retreated into the shadows, watching, waiting. I knew it was still there. I could feel its presence on the edge of my awareness. A faint, low-frequency hum in the back of my mind, the psychic equivalent of tinnitus. I was discharged after a year, a ghost of my former self. I couldn't be a nurse anymore. My hands trembled too much. I took a job as a librarian in a small town, a quiet, orderly life surrounded by the silent company of books. It was a life lived in the margins, a life of deliberate obscurity. I never married. I never had children. How could I? How could I risk bringing anyone else into my orbit, into the potential range of the signal? I was psychically radioactive, a pariah. My only connection to my past was a small, locked box that I kept hidden at the back of my closet. Inside it were two objects, the reel of audio tape and Captain Harding's journal. I never listened to the tape again. I never opened the journal, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy them. They were my proof, my evidence that I wasn't crazy, that what had happened was real. Decades passed, the Cold War ended, the world changed. But in my quiet, lonely life, nothing changed. I grew older. My hair turned gray. The fear never went away, but it subsided into a kind of chronic, low-grade ache, a permanent part of my emotional landscape. The nightmares of the city continued, a nightly pilgrimage to that terrible, silent place. They never changed, and they never stopped. The entity seemed to have settled into a routine, a stable broadcast, and I was its last lonely audience member. And then last night, everything changed again. I was watching the news, as I mentioned, and I saw the report about the new deep space probe. The DM-7, they called it, Dark Matter 7. They showed an animation of it, a sleek, modern satellite with a large, umbrella-like dish, unfurling in the blackness of space. And the lead scientist, that young, smiling man, talked about the interesting background noise it was picking up. He even played a short audio clip of it, a rhythmic, textured static, a low, persistent hum. It was the same sound, the exact same frequency and texture as the static on Thorne's tape, the sound that had preceded the activation of the thing inside John Harding. And as I listened to that sound, a sound I hadn't heard in the waking world for almost 50 years, the psychic tinnitus in my mind, the hum that had been a faint background noise for decades, suddenly surged. It grew in volume, from a whisper to a roar, a deafening, overwhelming thrum that filled my head, my bones, my very soul. It was like the entity in the desert had been asleep, or in a state of low-power hibernation, and this new signal, this new probe reaching out into the void, had woken it up. It was a wake-up call. And with the roar of the hum came a new, clear thought sliding into my mind with terrifying clarity. The first direct communication in decades. It is time. I felt a jolt of terror so profound it was like being struck by lightning. This wasn't just a memory. It was a message. A new phase was beginning. The long, silent waiting was over. And a new, more terrifying realization dawned on me. The entity hadn't been broadcasting the dream of the city to me all these years out of spite. It hadn't been a punishment. It had been a form of conditioning. It was keeping the neural pathways open, keeping me tuned to its frequency, maintaining the connection. For what? For this moment. I was its backup receiver, its emergency beacon. I looked at the television screen, where they were showing a diagram of the probe's trajectory. It was heading for the L2 Lagrange point, a gravitationally stable spot far beyond the moon. A place of quiet, of darkness, far from the interference of Earth's magnetic field. The same conditions as the apex of an X-15 flight. They weren't just observing a signal, they were sending one. And the thing in the desert was about to answer. In that moment, sitting in my quiet, lonely living room, I knew that my life of hiding was over. The silence was broken. The truce was void. I was no longer just a haunted survivor. I was a witness to the prelude of a second contact, and I was the only person on Earth who knew what was coming. I had to do something. I couldn't let it happen again. I couldn't let them open that door. I went to the closet and unlocked the small box. I took out the tape and the journal. There was only one thing left to do. I couldn't go to the authorities. They would lock me up and throw away the key. But I could leave a record, a warning, a confession. I wasn't going to run anymore. I was going to turn and face the signal. I was going to tell the world the truth of Experiment Sleeper. I was going to the source. Not the physical source in the desert, but the source of the story. I was going to tell it all. The decision to record this confession was an act of war. I knew that the moment I bought the cassette recorder. By speaking these words, by giving voice to the secret, I was making myself a primary target again. I was painting a giant psychic bullseye on my own forehead. I drove for 2 days, pushing my old tired car to its limits, heading west, back towards the desert. Not to Edwards, not to Nevada, but the landscape itself felt like a necessary backdrop. I needed to be in the place where it all began, to feel the dry heat and see the vast, empty sky. I found this motel, this anonymous little box on the edge of a forgotten highway, and I began to talk. For 2 days, I've been sitting in this room with the curtains drawn, speaking into this microphone. I've been reliving every moment, every terror, every whisper, and with every word I speak, the pressure in my head grows. The hum is a constant screaming roar now. It's a struggle to form my own thoughts, to keep my own voice from being drowned out by the psychic static. The entity knows what I am doing. It is furious. The attacks have started again, but they are different now. They are cruder, more violent. It's no longer playing subtle psychological games. It's a brute force assault. Last night, as I was describing the first dream, the lights in the room began to flicker and die, one by one, until I was left in total darkness. The television turned itself on, blasting static at full volume. I saw a handprint, a long, slender handprint with 7 fingers, appear on the inside of the fogged-up bathroom mirror. It is trying to stop me. It is throwing everything it has at me to shut me up. But I won't stop. I can't. This story has to be told. The journey to this final tape, this final act of defiance, has been a gauntlet. The entity is no longer just a ghost in my mind. It feels like a physical presence in this room. The air is thick, heavy, and cold. The shadows in the corners of the room seem to writhe and stretch when I'm not looking directly at them. It's trying to break through. The very fabric of reality feels thin here, worn down by the force of its rage. This morning I knew I was reaching the end of the story, and maybe the end of me. I had to describe the final piece of the puzzle, the culmination, the epilogue, the part of the story I have never allowed myself to fully confront. To do that, I needed to perform one final act of investigation. I needed to open the journal one last time. I took it out of its box, my hands shaking. I didn't open it to the beginning or to the last frantic entry. I let the pages fall open where they would, a final, desperate appeal to fate. And they opened to a page I had never seen before. It was near the very back of the book. It wasn't an entry. It was a drawing, a sketch, done with a compass and a ruler, with meticulous engineering precision. It was a complex geometric symbol, a non-Euclidean shape of interlocking impossible angles. It was the symbol I had seen on the EEG monitor in Harding's room, the entity's signature. And below the drawing was a short, handwritten equation, a complex string of physics and mathematical notation that I couldn't possibly understand. But scrawled next to the equation, in Harding's own hand, was a single, terrifying note. It read, "This is not a destination. It is a key to fold space a key to open a door. The voice says the body is the lock, but the signal is the door itself. I finally understood. The pilot's body wasn't the gateway. The broadcast was. The dream city. The psychic signal he was emitting. That was the anomaly. It was a bubble of another reality, expanding outwards from him, rewriting our world one dreaming mind at a time. The goal wasn't to bring something through him. The goal was to turn our world into that world, to overlay the dead city on top of our living one. He wasn't an antenna. He was a terraforming engine. And as I stared at that symbol in the journal, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the door to the final confrontation swung open in my mind. The entity, feeling my understanding, my final, complete comprehension of its plan, launched its final assault. The hum in my head exploded into a physical force, a wave of pressure that threw me back in my chair. The single lamp on the desk exploded, showering the room in sparks and darkness. The only light was the red, blinking glow of the vacancy sign outside, pulsing like a malevolent heart. The room grew impossibly cold. I could see my own breath fogging in the air. A sound began to fill the room, a low, guttural, clicking sound, like 1,000 insects chittering at once. The shadow in the corner of the room detached itself from the wall. It unfolded, stretched, and grew, rising up into a tall, impossibly thin silhouette. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at unnatural angles. It had no face, only a smooth, blank expanse of deeper darkness. But I could feel its gaze, a cold, ancient, and utterly alien intelligence focused entirely on me. This was it. The final guardian. The thing from the dream city. The architect, drawn through the veil by the force of my testimony. It was here, in this cheap motel room, to personally ensure my silence. I reached for the cassette recorder, my hand trembling, my only thought to protect the tape, to protect the story. The shadow thing took a step forward, its form wavering like heat haze. The clicking sound grew louder, more insistent, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the end. I was about to be erased, not by a man in a suit, but by the thing from beyond the stars. I closed my eyes, took a final, shuddering breath, and clutched the tape recorder to my chest. The air in the room dropped to freezing. The clicking was right beside my ear, and in the absolute, terrifying darkness, I saw it. The image that had been burned into my mind for 50 years. The black sun. But it wasn't in a dream anymore. It was here. The darkness in the room was absolute, a physical presence that smothered light and sound. The clicking stopped. The cold intensified until it was a burning pain on my skin. And in the center of that darkness, hovering in the air before me, was the black sun. It was exactly as I'd seen it in the dream 1,000 times. A perfect disk of nothingness, a hole in the universe. It didn't radiate cold. It absorbed heat. It absorbed light. It absorbed all energy, leaving a void in its wake. This was the entity's true form, or as close as my human mind could comprehend it. It wasn't a monster of flesh and bone. It was a principle, a law of physics from another reality. It was an absence, a cosmic full stop. The confrontation wasn't a fight. It was an exposure. To be in its presence was to feel my own existence, my own consciousness, begin to unravel. My memories, my identity, my sense of self. It felt like they were being pulled from me, drawn into that silent black disk like iron filings to a magnet. I could feel the Evelyn Reed I had been for 70+ years dissolving, becoming just another piece of data to be consumed. This was its power, erasure. And in that final, terrifying moment, as my own mind began to fray, The last devastating piece of the puzzle was laid bare before me. It wasn't a thought in words. It was a pure, conceptual understanding downloaded directly into the wreckage of my consciousness. The project at Edwards hadn't been an accident. The signal that activated Harding hadn't been an invasion. The entity wasn't a hostile conqueror. I saw the truth in a flash of terrible, sublime insight. We had invited it. Decades before the X-15 program, a small, secret cabal of scientists and mystics within the government, the true progenitors of projects like Stargate, had found something. An artifact. A fossilized piece of a creature that did not evolve on Earth. In that fossil, they found the key, the geometric language of the city. They thought it was the key to unlocking humanity's latent psychic potential, the key to winning the Cold War. They didn't understand. They thought they were building a key to open a door to a higher plane. They were wrong. They were building a lock to fit a key that was already on its way. They began a secret breeding program, subtly manipulating the bloodlines of certain families, looking for a candidate with the right genetic makeup, the right latent psychic resonance, to become the lock. A human being who could be tuned to the frequency of the artifact. They found him in a small boy in Ohio who could hear the world humming. John Harding. His entire life, his career as a test pilot, his selection for the X-15 program, it wasn't a coincidence. It was a carefully orchestrated plan to get the lock into a position where the key could find it. They didn't know what would come through the door. They just knew they wanted to be the ones to open it. Project Sleeper wasn't a containment effort. It was a desperate, panicked attempt by a new generation of the military to understand and control the god their predecessors had summoned and lost control of. Dr. Thorne, Major Harding, me. We were just the janitors, trying to clean up a mess of cosmic proportions. The thing in front of me wasn't an invader. It was a guest who had been invited to a party, and it had been waiting patiently for the doors to open. And now, I was the last loose end, the last person who knew the full, horrifying truth of the invitation. It had to erase me. But in that moment of revelation, a strange, cold clarity washed over me. The fear was gone, burned away by the sheer, awful magnitude of the truth. I was going to die, but I wasn't going to be erased. My story, this tape, would survive. I clutched the cassette recorder to my chest. It was the only thing that mattered. My final, desperate, sacrificial plan wasn't to fight it. It was to give it what it wanted. Me. All of me. "All right," I whispered into the void, my voice a raw, cracked thing. "You want me. Take me. But you leave this. You leave the story." I don't know if it understood, or if it even cared, but I focused every last ounce of my will, my life force, my very soul, on one single desperate act. I pushed my consciousness out, towards the black sun. I didn't resist the erasure. I embraced it. I offered myself up as a sacrifice, a final, blinding flare of human identity, hoping that the sheer energy of my self-destruction would be enough of a distraction to shield the small, physical object in my hands. The black disk seemed to pulse, to expand. The feeling of unraveling intensified 1,000-fold. My life flashed before my eyes, not as a series of images, but as a torrent of pure data being stripped away. My first day of school, the face of my mother, the feel of sunlight on my skin, the terror in Sarah's eyes, the smell of the desert, the taste of cheap motel coffee. Everything that was me, every sensation, every memory, every thought was pulled from me and consumed by the silent, hungry void. It was a pain beyond any physical description, the pain of becoming nothing. The room dissolved. The world dissolved. There was only the roar of the hum and the all-consuming blackness of the sun. My finger, in its last spastic act of defiance, tightened on the stop button of the cassette recorder. There was a loud mechanical click, and then a blinding flash of white light that was the opposite of the black sun. A light of pure, absolute existence. It erupted from within me, from the last spark of my soul refusing to be extinguished. The light consumed the darkness. There was a deafening roar, a wave of force that felt like it was tearing the very atoms of the world apart. Then, abrupt, total silence and darkness. The real kind. The kind you find when you just close your eyes. The first thing I remember is the smell. Not ozone and stars, not stale smoke and bleach. It was the scent of clean, sterile sheets and antiseptic. The second thing was a sound, a soft, rhythmic beeping, slow and steady. A heart monitor. I opened my eyes. The light was dim, soft. I was in a bed, a hospital bed. My body ached with a deep, profound weariness, the kind that comes after a long illness. But I was whole. I was here. I was me. I could remember my name, Evelyn Reed. I could remember the motel room, the black sun, the final sacrificial act. A man in a simple dark suit was sitting in a chair by the bed. He wasn't a doctor. He had the quiet, watchful stillness of a government agent. He noticed I was awake and leaned forward slightly. "Good morning, Ms. Reed," he said, his voice calm and neutral. "You gave us quite a scare." I tried to speak, but my throat was raw. "What?" I managed to rasp. "How?" "The motel owner found you," the man said simply. "Unconscious on the floor. An apparent gas leak from a faulty heater. Carbon monoxide poisoning. You were very lucky. You've been here for 2 days. A gas leak. Of course. A neat, tidy, plausible explanation. A cover story. The entity," I whispered. It was there. The man's expression didn't change. He showed no surprise, no confusion. He just nodded slowly. "We know," he said. "We detected a significant electromagnetic and other energy release from your location. An event. We intercepted the emergency call. We brought you here." "Here." I looked around. The room was featureless, windowless. It wasn't a civilian hospital. This was one of their places. "The tape," I said, my voice filled with a sudden, desperate panic. "The recorder. My things. They're safe," the man said. "We have them." He stood up and was replaced by 2 new men. They were identical in their dark suits and their impassive, bureaucratic expressions. They were the men who erase things. They sat down, one on either side of my bed. The debriefing, I realized, was about to begin. But it wasn't an interrogation. It was a statement. "Evelyn Reed," the first one said, "is a retired librarian with no family who tragically died from carbon monoxide poisoning in a roadside motel. Her effects, of little value, were disposed of. You," the second one said, his eyes cold and empty, "are a woman who has suffered a severe psychological trauma. You will be well cared for. You will be given a new name, a new life, in a comfortable, quiet facility. You will want for nothing. In return, you will maintain your silence. The story you have concocted, the tape you have made, it ends here. It is a fantasy, a product of your illness. The horror of it was not supernatural. It was chillingly human. They weren't threatening me with violence. They were threatening me with non-existence. They were going to bury me in comfort, cocoon me in a quiet, pleasant lie until I died. My story, my sacrifice would mean nothing. It would be a secret locked in a vault, next to the Ark of the Covenant and the Roswell debris. You don't understand, I pleaded, my voice weak. It's not over. The new probe, the DM-7, it's waking it up. You have to stop it. The first man almost smiled. It was a cold, thin, terrible thing. The anomaly at Site Nightingale has been contained and monitored for 50 years, Ms. Reed. We are well aware of its state of activity. The DM7 probe is not a mistake. It is a project. We have learned a great deal since your time. We have learned how to listen. We have learned how to communicate. And there it was. The final, crushing truth. They hadn't learned a thing. The new generation, the new cabal, was making the same mistake all over again. They weren't trying to stop it. They were trying to control it, to weaponize it. They were ringing the dinner bell, thinking they could negotiate with the thing that answered. I fell back against the pillows, defeated. Utterly and completely defeated. They had won. The story would be buried, and I would be buried with it. And so, here I am. They let me keep this recorder, my last companion. A small act of cruelty, or perhaps pity. They don't know. I have one last tape. This one. The one I am making now, whispering into the microphone in the dead of night, in this quiet, comfortable prison. They think I am broken. They think I have given up. But they are wrong, because somehow this tape will find its way out. Someone will hear it. Someone has to, because the hum is getting stronger. I can feel it even here. The signal is being amplified. The door is being opened again, wider this time. They gave me a new name, a new life, and told me to forget. But I can't, because sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the world is asleep, I can still hear the static, and I know it's still listening. So, that's the story of Evelyn Reed and Experiment Sleeper. A story of how the noble ambition to touch the stars led to a 50-year silence filled with the echo of an alien broadcast. It's a testament to the idea that some doors in the universe are meant to remain locked, not because of what might get in, but because of what might be awakened on our side of the threshold. Officially, Captain John Harding died in a training accident in 1969. But you and I, we know the truth now. He didn't die. He just became the keyhole for a door that should never have been opened. Thank you for watching until the very end. If this story made you think, or perhaps look a little more nervously at the static on a screen, support the channel with a like and subscribe. And be sure to share your own theories in the comments below. Until next time, be careful what you dream. Sometimes you're not the only one who's watching.